When most people think of World War II, images of fast-moving tanks, roaring aircraft, and swarms of infantry charging across muddy fields often come to mind. But behind the thunder of tank engines and the roar of fighter planes, there was another kind of war being fought. A war of heavy steel, massive shells, and the earth-shaking roar of giant artillery pieces. Among these battlefield giants, one American weapon stood out. It was not the fastest, nor the easiest to use. It wasn't glamorous like a fighter plane or feared like a tank division. But when it spoke, fortresses crumbled, bunkers collapsed, and the ground itself seemed to tremble. It was the U.S. 240mm howitzer M1, the heaviest field artillery piece ever deployed by the United States during the war. To the Germans who faced it, this colossal cannon became a symbol of inevitability. Concrete fortifications that once seemed impregnable shattered under its shells. Command posts buried deep underground were torn open. Bunkers that had withstood years of construction and layers of steel-reinforced concrete were reduced to rubble in minutes. For the Americans, the 240mm was a problem solver, the fortress killer they needed to crack open the Siegfried Line and punch through the toughest German defenses. For the Germans, it was a nightmare, an unstoppable reminder that even the strongest walls could be brought down with enough firepower. The problem of the fortress. To understand why the 240mm howitzer was created, we must step back to the early years of the war. The First World War had already demonstrated the power of fortifications and the difficulty of destroying them. From the Belgian forts at Liège to the concrete bunkers of Verdun, the Western Front became a graveyard of infantry assaults against heavily fortified positions. In many cases, only the largest siege artillery, massive railway guns, or heavy howitzers could make a dent in such defenses. The Germans learned from this experience. As Adolf Hitler prepared for war in the late 1930s, he ordered the construction of an elaborate defensive line along Germany's western border, the Westwall, better known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line. Stretching over 390 miles, the Siegfried Line bristled with obstacles. Thousands of bunkers, pillboxes, tank traps, and artillery emplacements. Many of these fortifications were built with thick walls of reinforced concrete, capable of withstanding smaller artillery shells. For the U.S. Army planners watching the conflict unfold, one fact became clear. If America was going to go toe-to-toe with Germany and Europe, it would need more than standard field guns. It would need artillery capable of smashing apart bunkers designed to resist everything short of an earthquake. Birth of the beast. The solution came in the form of the 240mm howitzer M1. Development began in the 1930s, but the weapon wasn't ready until 1943. By then, the war had already been raging for 4 years, and the U.S. was preparing for its push into Europe. The weapon was colossal. The barrel alone stretched nearly 27 feet long. The entire system, when mounted on its carriage, weighed over 64,000 pounds, more than 32 tons. It fired a shell that weighed 360 pounds, about the same as a full-grown man. These shells could travel up to 25,000 yards, over 14 miles. And when they landed, the explosion was enough to shatter concrete and crater the earth. But the gun came with challenges. It was so massive that it couldn't simply be towed like a normal field gun. Instead, it had to be broken down into 2 loads, the barrel and the carriage, each hauled by its own special tractor. Setting it up took hours, sometimes a full day. Firing it required a crew of more than 30 men working in careful coordination. It was not a weapon for fast-moving battles. It was a siege gun, designed for deliberate operations where fortresses, cities, or heavily defended lines stood in the way. Why Germany feared it. By 1944, the Germans had already witnessed the devastating power of heavy artillery. Their own superweapons, like the Karlgerät self-propelled mortars and the gigantic Schwerer-Gustav railway gun had been used to reduce fortresses in the Soviet Union. But Germany did not expect the United States, a nation often seen as favoring mobility, mechanization, and air power, to deploy such a weapon. The shot came when the Allies began moving closer to Germany's fortified western borders. Smaller guns and even aerial bombardment often failed to neutralize hardened bunkers. But when the 240mm was brought up, the results were undeniable. Entire bunker complexes were flattened. Pillboxes that had been designed to resist everything short of naval gunfire were blown apart. And because the weapon fired indirectly, shells could plunge down at steep angles, striking roofs and buried chambers that smaller guns could not reach. German soldiers began to dread the distinctive thunder of the 240mm. Unlike smaller guns whose shells whistled overhead, the 240mm shells moved slower, producing a low, ominous rumble before impact. Survivors described the terror of hearing the incoming rounds, followed by the deafening crash as concrete cracked and the earth convulsed beneath their feet. Setting the stage. As the Allies pushed inland after D-Day, the Siegfried Line loomed ahead. For months, the Germans had been preparing to make a stand there. American infantry divisions, though battle-hardened from Normandy and the hedgerows of France, now faced some of the strongest defenses ever built. The 240mm howitzer was not a common sight on the battlefield. Only a handful of battalions were equipped with them. But when called upon, they became the sledgehammer that cracked open the door to Germany. In the months to come, this weapon would reduce mighty fortresses to rubble, silence heavily defended strongpoints, and earn its reputation as the fortress killer. The story is the U.S. 240mm howitzer M1, the weapon that made the Germans tremble, shattered the Siegfried Line, and proved that when America put its industrial might into steel and fire, even the strongest walls could not hold.
Setting the stage. As the Allies pushed inland after D-Day, the Siegfried Line loomed ahead. For months, the Germans had been preparing to make a stand there. American infantry divisions, though battle-hardened from Normandy and the hedgerows of France, now faced some of the strongest defenses ever built. The 240mm howitzer was not a common sight on the battlefield. Only a handful of battalions were equipped with them. But when called upon, they became the sledgehammer that cracked open the door to Germany. In the months to come, this weapon would reduce mighty fortresses to rubble, silence heavily defended strongpoints, and earn its reputation as the fortress killer. This is the story of the U.S. 240mm howitzer, M1, the weapon that made the Germans tremble, shattered the Siegfried Line, and proved that when America put its industrial might into steel and fire, even the strongest walls could not hold. To understand why the 240mm howitzer M1 struck terror into German defenders, we need to look closely at the weapon itself, its design, its power, and the sheer logistical miracle that allowed it to fire on the battlefields of Europe. Design and engineering. The 240mm howitzer M1 was the heaviest field artillery piece ever built and deployed by the United States during World War II. Development began in the interwar years, when U.S. Army planners studied the failures of World War I artillery against heavily fortified positions. What they learned was clear. The U.S. needed a gun that could break concrete. The howitzer was enormous. Its barrel stretched more than 27 feet in length. The carriage that supported it added another massive frame of steel beams, wheels, and hydraulics. Fully assembled, the gun weighed over 64,000 pounds, about the same as a fully loaded Sherman tank. The heart of the weapon, of course, was its shell. Each round measured 240 millimeters, 9.4 inches in diameter, and weighed around 360 pounds. That was as much as an average man and nearly impossible to move without mechanical help. When fired, these shells could travel up to 25,225 yards, roughly 14.3 miles. At the end of that journey, the shell would smash into its target with an explosive charge powerful enough to penetrate several feet of reinforced concrete. This wasn't just firepower. It was a deliberate tool of siege warfare. Mobility and transport. But raw firepower came at a cost. The 240mm howitzer M1 was not a gun that could be quickly repositioned like a standard 105mm howitzer or a 155mm gun. In fact, it was one of the most logistically demanding weapons in the entire U.S. arsenal. To move it, the gun had to be broken down into two separate loads. One for the barrel, which alone weighed nearly 16 tons. One for the carriage and recoil system, which weighed another 16 tons. Each section was hauled on a specially designed M6 high-speed tractor, a powerful, tracked vehicle built specifically to move such heavy loads. Once on site, setting up the howitzer was a full-day task. The crew needed to dig in the carriage, assemble the barrel, and carefully align the weapon with surveying equipment. This was not something you rolled up to the front line. It was deliberate, methodical, and planned well in advance. But once in place, the 240mm howitzer became a fortress in its own right. Crew and operation. Operating the howitzer required a crew of more than 30 men. Ammunition handlers wrestled with the massive shells, often using cranes and hoists to move them into position. Loaders rammed the shell and powder charge into the breech. Gunners calculated range, trajectory, and wind adjustments with slide rules and plotting tables. Commanders coordinated with spotters, who directed fire from observation posts miles away. Firing the weapon was an event in itself. First, the crew loaded the giant shell. Then came the powder bags, multiple charges of propellant that would be adjusted depending on the range. When the breech was closed and locked, everyone stepped back. With a deafening blast, the howitzer spoke. The shockwave rolled across the countryside, rattling windows miles away. The barrel recoiled violently, absorbed by a complex hydraulic system. Seconds later, far across the battlefield, the shell would land with an earth-shaking explosion, sending up clouds of dust and debris as concrete cracked and steel supports twisted apart. This wasn't just firepower. It was a deliberate tool of siege warfare. Comparison to German guns. The Germans were no strangers to heavy artillery. They had built some of the most famous super weapons of the war. The Karl Gerät 60-centimeter mortar, which fired a 2-ton shell capable of destroying fortresses. The Schwerer Gustav railway gun, the largest artillery piece ever built, firing 7-ton shells over 20 miles. But there was a key difference. German superguns were so massive that they were more propaganda than practical weapons. The Gustav required thousands of men, weeks of preparation, and a dedicated railway just to set up. It could only fire a handful of shells per day, and its targets were limited. But the 240mm howitzer struck a balance. It was massive, but not so massive that it was unusable. It could be transported on normal roads, deployed by a battalion in the field, and integrated into regular army operations. In other words, it was practical, and that made it far deadlier than Germany's wonder weapons. A soldier's perspective. Imagine being a German soldier stationed inside the Siegfried Line bunker in late 1944.
You've been told that your concrete fortress is impregnable. Its walls are 5 feet thick. Its roof is reinforced with steel. You've endured artillery before, 105 millimeter shells, even 155 millimeter shells, and the bunker held. Then you hear it, a low, distant roar. Not the sharp crack of a field gun, not the whistling shriek of smaller shells, but something slower, heavier. The ground seems to hum with the vibration. A split second later, impact. The roof above you shudders, dust rains down, and somewhere in the darkness, concrete cracks. A second hit follows, then a third. Within minutes, the impregnable fortress begins to crumble. Panic spreads among the men. If the roof collapses, there will be no escape. This was the psychological effect of the 240. It didn't just kill, it crushed the enemy's will to resist. Why it was feared. The Germans gave the weapon nicknames. Some simply called it the Big American. Others compared it to an earthquake in a box. Reports from captured German soldiers often mentioned the despair they felt when under bombardment from the 240. It was, in effect, America's answer to the fortress problem. Air power could devastate cities, but often missed hardened targets. Medium artillery could harass enemy troops, but rarely destroyed bunkers. But the 240 millimeter howitzer solved the problem with brute force. Concrete was no longer safe, steel was no longer protection. The 240 millimeter howitzer M1 was not built to fight every battle. It was built for the decisive ones, the sieges, the assaults, the moments when the enemy thought his walls could keep him safe. And in the winter of 1944, as the Allies closed in on Germany's fortified heartland, those walls were about to be tested.
Strategic necessity in Europe. The summer of 1944 was a turning point in the Second World War. After the successful landings in Normandy on June 6th, Allied forces poured into France. The breakout from the beaches turned into a rolling offensive, with American, British, and Canadian armies racing across the countryside. German forces, already weakened, were pushed back faster than anyone expected. For a moment, it seemed as if the war might be over by Christmas. But then the Allies slammed into an obstacle that speed and numbers alone could not overcome: the German fortress system known as the Siegfried Line. The shadow of the Siegfried Line. The Germans had been preparing for this moment for years. The Siegfried Line, or Westwall, stretched from the Swiss border in the south to the Netherlands in the north. It was an engineering marvel made up of nearly 20,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and fortified positions. Some were small machine gun nests, but many were massive fortresses with interlocking fields of fire, underground tunnels, and reinforced artillery positions. These were not crude concrete boxes. Many of the bunkers had walls over 5 feet thick, with steel cupolas on top for observation. Some were buried into hillsides. Others had underground chambers with electricity, ventilation, and supplies to withstand long sieges. The Siegfried Line wasn't just a wall, it was a psychological weapon. To German soldiers, it symbolized security, a chance to finally stop the Allied advance. To American planners, it was a nightmare, a barrier that could consume thousands of lives in bloody frontal assaults if not dealt with properly. This was where the 240 millimeter howitzer M1 became a necessity. Why smaller guns weren't enough? By 1944, the U.S. Army had a wide array of artillery. The most common were 105 millimeter howitzers, the workhorses of infantry divisions. They were mobile and reliable, but lacked the punch against reinforced structures. 155 millimeters and guns, which delivered heavier shells, but still struggled against thick concrete bunkers. 8-inch howitzers, or 203 millimeters, powerful but still not guaranteed to destroy the largest German fortifications.
Time and time again, Allied artillerymen saw the same problem. Fire missions would bombard German bunkers for hours, only for enemy machine guns to open fire again once the barrage ended. Even aerial bombardment was not a silver bullet. The U.S. 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command could flatten cities, but pinpoint strikes on bunkers often missed. Many fortifications were camouflaged, hardened, and dug deep into the earth. Bombers might drop tons of explosives nearby, but the bunkers held firm. The Americans needed something more, something that could guarantee destruction of the strongest German defenses. The 240mm howitzer was the answer. From planning tables to battlefields, American planners had anticipated this problem before D-Day. They knew the Siegfried Line was waiting. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department began equipping heavy artillery battalions with the 240mm howitzer starting in 1943. But there was a catch. These guns were too slow and cumbersome for the fast-moving battles of Normandy and the breakout across France. In those months, mobility was key. The Allies needed to keep pressure on the retreating Germans, not pause to set up siege guns. So the 240mm remained in reserve, waiting.
The fortress problem. Concrete was the true enemy. German engineers had perfected reinforced concrete construction, combining thick walls with steel reinforcements. Tests showed that standard 105mm or 155mm shells could chip or scar a bunker, but rarely penetrate. Even multiple direct hits often failed to collapse them. The 240mm, however, was different. Its massive shells could crack open what other guns could not. When a 360-pound shell slammed into a bunker roof at high velocity, the result was devastating. Shock waves traveled through the concrete, causing it to fracture. If a second shell landed in the same area, the cracks widened. By the third or fourth hit, entire sections of roof caved in. This made the 240mm uniquely suited to fortress destruction. Instead of bombarding a position with hundreds of smaller shells, a handful of 240mm rounds could neutralize it. Case study: Metz, France. One of the earliest demonstrations of the 240mm necessity came in the siege of Metz, a heavily fortified city in northeastern France. The Germans had spent years strengthening Metz, equipping it with over 40 major forts, some dating back to the 19th century, but updated with modern concrete and steel. The U.S. Third Army, under General George S. Patton, found itself bogged down against these fortresses in the fall of 1944. Smaller artillery had little effect. Airstrikes helped, but many bunkers remained intact. Then came the 240mm howitzers. When they opened fire, the results were immediate and dramatic. Shells smashed into the forts, collapsing gun emplacements, caving in underground chambers, and forcing German defenders to surrender positions they had believed were indestructible. Metz became a proving ground for the fortress killer, showing the U.S. Army that it now possessed the one tool capable of cracking the toughest German strongholds. Psychological warfare. There was another layer to the strategic necessity of the 240mm: psychological impact. Artillery is often called the king of battle, not just for its destructive power, but for the fear it inspires. German soldiers already dreaded American artillery barrages, which were well coordinated and relentless. But the 240mm was different. Survivors described the sound of its shells as uniquely terrifying. Instead of the high-pitched whistle of smaller rounds, the 240mm produced a low, growling rumble as it cut through the sky. The impact was cataclysmic, shaking the ground like an earthquake. German prisoners later told interrogators that once they realized the Americans had such a weapon, their confidence in their fortifications evaporated. If concrete could not protect them, where could they hide? This fear factor was just as important as the physical destruction. The 240mm didn't just break walls, it broke morale. Integration into Allied strategy. By late 1944,
Heavy artillery battalions equipped with the 240mm howitzers were integrated into key offensives. Their role was clear: destroy Siegfried Line bunkers ahead of infantry assaults, neutralize German strongpoints that resisted conventional fire, shatter urban fortifications, paving the way for street fighting. Every time the Allies faced a fortified city or stubborn bunker complex, the 240mm was called in. It became a specialist tool, deployed not everywhere, but in the places that mattered most. A war of logistics. The strategic necessity of the 240mm also highlighted America's greatest strength: logistics. Moving a weapon that weighed 32 tons in 2 loads, plus its ammunition, each shell nearly 400 pounds, was a nightmare. But the United States had the trucks, tractors, and supply chains to make it possible. This was something the Germans increasingly lacked. By late 1944, fuel shortages and Allied air power crippled German logistics. They could barely supply their tanks, let alone move their own super-heavy artillery. In contrast, the U.S. could not only deploy the 240mm, but feed it with a steady stream of shells. That logistical superiority turned the howitzer from a theoretical weapon into a battlefield reality. Strategic symbolism. The 240mm was more than a gun. It was a symbol. For the Americans, it represented overwhelming firepower, proof that no obstacle could permanently block their advance. For the Germans, it represented futility, a reminder that even their strongest defenses were temporary. By the time Allied troops stood before the Siegfried Line, the 240mm howitzer M1 was no longer just an artillery piece. It was a strategic necessity, the sledgehammer that would open the gates to Germany itself. In the fall of 1944, as the Allies faced the formidable walls of the Siegfried Line, the stage was set for the 240mm howitzer to prove its worth. The weapon had been designed for this very moment, to smash through concrete, to collapse fortresses, and to remind the enemy that no wall could stand forever. And when it finally unleashed its fury on the German defenses, the results were as devastating as they were inevitable.
First blood, baptism of fire. The U.S. Army's 240mm howitzer M1 was designed for one purpose: to obliterate fortresses. By the fall of 1944, the time had come to unleash it. For months, the massive guns had waited, hauled across France in convoys of tractors and trucks, prepared for the day when the Allied advance slammed into Germany's strongest defenses. That day arrived on the approaches to Metz and the Siegfried Line. The first deployments. The first U.S. heavy artillery battalions equipped with 240mm howitzers began arriving on the continent in late summer 1944. Among them were the 540th Field Artillery Battalion and the 575th Field Artillery Battalion, units specially trained to operate the monster guns. Each battalion had 12 of the massive howitzers, broken into firing batteries. Their movement was an operation in itself. Dozens of tractors, cranes, trucks loaded with shells, and survey crews working together like clockwork. When the guns were finally brought forward to Metz in September 1944, American soldiers and local French civilians gathered to watch. Even hardened veterans were struck by the sheer size of the weapon. One GI later recalled, "When you stood next to it, you felt small. That barrel was longer than a telephone pole, and when it fired, it was like standing next to a freight train." For the artillery crews, the upcoming mission was both a test of skill and a moment of history. They knew the 240mm had been built for this exact task, and they were about to prove it. Target: the forts of Metz. The ancient fortress city of Metz was one of the toughest nuts to crack in Europe. Its network of forts, updated with reinforced concrete,
had been designed to resist exactly the kind of weapons most armies carried. General George S. Patton's Third Army surrounded Metz in the fall of 1944. His troops were exhausted, supply lines stretched thin, and the weather turning against them. Worse, German defenders inside the forts refused to yield. Standard artillery bombarded the defenses day after day. 105mm and 155mm guns poured shells onto the forts. Medium bombers dropped their payloads. But many bunkers and gun positions remained intact, their thick walls shrugging off the smaller blasts. It was time for the fortress killer. The first shots. On a gray September morning, the 240mm howitzers were positioned against the forts of Metz. Crews worked for hours to emplace the guns, securing their carriages in the muddy ground, checking elevation and range. Forward observers in church steeples and aircraft relayed target coordinates. When the order came, the first round was loaded. A massive 360-pound high-explosive shell rammed into the breach by a team straining under its weight. Powder charges followed. The crew stepped back. The lanyard was pulled. With a thunderous roar, the 240mm howitzer fired its first shot in anger. The ground shook. The barrel recoiled violently, then slid back into position. Across the battlefield, moments later, a German fort shuddered as the shell slammed into its roof. Dust and debris shot skyward. Inside the bunker, German defenders staggered as the ceiling cracked, sending showers of stone and concrete onto their heads. A second shell followed, then a third. By the time the first firing mission was complete, the impregnable fortress was battered and broken. German reactions. For the German defenders, the experience was unlike anything they had faced before. Machine gunner Heinrich Bauer, stationed inside one of the Metz bunkers, later recalled, "We had survived artillery barrages for weeks. The walls would shake, but they always held. But when the heavy American shells came, it was different. The whole bunker shook as if struck by an earthquake. We felt helpless." Another German officer wrote in his diary, "We have a new weapon. Our strongest positions are collapsing. Morale is breaking. We can no longer count on the west wall to hold." The 240mm was more than just another gun. It was a revelation, a weapon that rendered Germany's strongest defenses obsolete. The effect on American troops. For American infantrymen, the arrival of the 240mm was a godsend. Up until then, storming a German bunker often meant crawling across open ground under fire, then throwing grenades or flamethrowers through firing slits. Casualties were high, and success was never guaranteed. But now, the big guns could do the job before the infantry went in. Private John Reynolds of the 95th Infantry Division remembered the first time he saw a German pillbox reduced by 240mm fire. It was like watching a magician. One minute, the bunker was there, spitting fire at us. Then the big gun roared, and suddenly half the roof was gone. By the time we moved up, the Germans inside were either dead or ready to surrender. For frontline soldiers, the 240mm was more than artillery. It was salvation. The spread of the fortress killer. After Metz, the word spread quickly. Commanders across the front began requesting 240mm support. Whenever the Siegfried Line loomed ahead, with its thick bunkers and pillboxes, battalions with the giant howitzers were called in. The Germans began to dread them. Reports from prisoners revealed the growing psychological toll. Many soldiers described the weapon as unstoppable. Some believed it was a naval gun brought inland. Others claimed it was a new kind of earthquake cannon. Whatever the rumors, the effect was the same: fear. A turning point. The baptism of fire for the 240mm howitzer at Metz marked a turning point in the U.S. campaign in Europe. It proved that no fortress was invulnerable, no bunker unbreakable. From that moment on, the 240 millimeter became a central part of the Allied strategy for breaking through the Siegfried Line and pushing into Germany. Wherever the Americans faced concrete and steel, the fortress killer followed.
Breaking the Siegfried Line. By the fall of 1944, the American advance across France had slowed. The war that once seemed on the verge of ending dragged on. Ahead loomed Germany's last great defensive belt, the Siegfried Line, or as the Germans called it, the West Wall. Stretching over 390 miles, bristling with bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and machine gun nests, the Siegfried Line was meant to be impregnable. German propaganda called it a wall of iron that no invader could break. But the U.S. Army brought something new to the battlefield, the 240 millimeter howitzer, M1. The West Wall, a fortress of concrete and steel. The Siegfried Line had been constructed in the 1930s, a mirror to France's Maginot Line. Thousands of pillboxes, observation posts, and artillery bunkers had been built from reinforced concrete, some with walls up to 10 feet thick. Inside, German garrisons huddled in relative safety. Machine guns could sweep entire fields of fire, while underground tunnels connected firing points to shelters. For months, American infantry had learned the price of attacking such positions head-on. Grenades, flamethrowers, and satchel charges could sometimes clear a bunker, but at heavy cost. Progress was slow, bloody, and exhausting. If the Allies hoped to push into Germany before winter, they needed a way to crack the West Wall open. That answer came from the fortress killer, deploying the 240 millimeter against the line. By October 1944, U.S. High Command began systematically assigning 240 millimeter howitzer battalions to sectors facing the Siegfried Line. The 540th Field Artillery Battalion supported the Third Army. The 575th Field Artillery Battalion joined assaults in the Saar region. Other units were rotated wherever the concrete proved too strong. The deployment was an engineering feat in itself. Roads had to be widened, bridges reinforced, gun positions carved out of forests and farmland. Once emplaced, the 240 crews went to work. Each gun could only fire 40 rounds a day due to the sheer strain of operation, but each shell was worth its weight in gold. The bunker-busting missions. Observers described the effect of the first bombardments against the Siegfried bunkers as astonishing. 105 millimeter shells left scorch marks. 155 millimeter shells left cracks. But a single 240 millimeter shell could tear off an entire bunker face. The thick concrete roofs that once protected German machine gunners shattered under the massive blasts. Doors buckled, ventilation shafts collapsed. One American officer remarked, "It was the first time we saw the Siegfried Line give way. The Germans had faith in their concrete. After the 240s fired, that faith was gone." German fear and rumors. For the German defenders, the appearance of the 240 millimeter was devastating, not only physically but also psychologically. Many had grown used to artillery barrages. Standard fire, while terrifying, could usually be endured. Bunkers provided shelter, but the 240 stripped away that illusion of safety. Captured prisoners often described the weapon in almost mythical terms. Some called it a bunker breaker. Others swore it was a naval cannon dragged inland from battleships. Many admitted morale collapsed once the big guns opened fire. A German NCO later confessed, "When the heavy American shells came, we no longer felt protected. Even underground, the air seemed to be sucked out of the bunker. The walls trembled, and we thought the earth itself was splitting apart."
First blood, baptism of fire. The U.S. Army's 240 millimeter howitzer M1 was designed for one purpose: to obliterate fortresses. By the fall of 1944, the time had come to unleash it. For months, the massive guns had waited, hauled across France in convoys of tractors and trucks, prepared for the day when the Allied advance slammed into Germany's strongest defenses. That day arrived on the approaches to Metz and the Siegfried Line. The first deployments. The first U.S. heavy artillery battalions equipped with 240 millimeter howitzers began arriving on the continent in late summer 1944. Among them were the 540th Field Artillery Battalion and the 575th Field Artillery Battalion, units specially trained to operate the monster guns. Each battalion had 12 of the massive howitzers, broken into firing batteries. Their movement was an operation in itself. Dozens of tractors, cranes, trucks loaded with shells, and survey crews working together like clockwork. When the guns were finally brought forward to Metz in September 1944, American soldiers and local French civilians gathered to watch. Even hardened veterans were struck by the sheer size of the weapon. One GI later recalled, "When you stood next to it, you felt small. That barrel was longer than a telephone pole, and when it fired, it was like standing next to a freight train." For the artillery crews, the upcoming mission was both a test of skill and a moment of history. They knew the 240mm had been built for this exact task, and they were about to prove it. Target: the forts of Metz. The ancient fortress city of Metz was one of the toughest nuts to crack in Europe. Its network of forts, updated with reinforced concrete, had been designed to resist exactly the kind of weapons most armies carried. General George S. Patton's Third Army surrounded Metz in the fall of 1944. His troops were exhausted, supply lines stretched thin, and the weather turning against them. Worse, German defenders inside the forts refused to yield. Standard artillery bombarded the defenses day after day. 105mm and 155mm guns poured shells onto the forts. Medium bombers dropped their payloads. But many bunkers and gun positions remained intact, their thick walls shrugging off the smaller blasts. It was time for the fortress killer. The first shots. On a gray September morning, the 240mm howitzers were positioned against the forts of Metz. Crews worked for hours to emplace the guns, securing their carriages in the muddy ground, checking elevation and range. Forward observers in church steeples and aircraft relayed target coordinates. When the order came, the first round was loaded. A massive 360-pound high-explosive shell rammed into the breech by a team straining under its weight. Powder charges followed. The crew stepped back. The lanyard was pulled. With a thunderous roar, the 240mm howitzer fired its first shot in anger. The ground shook. The barrel recoiled violently, then slid back into position. Across the battlefield, moments later, a German fort shuddered as the shell slammed into its roof. Dust and debris shot skyward. Inside the bunker, German defenders staggered as the ceiling cracked, sending showers of stone and concrete onto their heads. A second shell followed, then a third. By the time the first firing mission was complete, the impregnable fortress was battered and broken. German reactions. For the German defenders, the experience was unlike anything they had faced before. Machine gunner Heinrich Bauer, stationed inside one of the Metz bunkers, later recalled, "We had survived artillery barrages for weeks. The walls would shake, but they always held. But when the heavy American shells came, it was different. The whole bunker shook as if struck by an earthquake. We felt helpless." Another German officer wrote in his diary, "We have a new weapon. Our strongest positions are collapsing. Morale is breaking. We can no longer count on the West Wall to hold." The 240mm was more than just another gun. It was a revelation, a weapon that rendered Germany's strongest defenses obsolete.